So, balance in role-playing games is something a lot of people talk about, from game designers to major YouTubers to that one realism-obsessed player who thinks you should keep track of how much water is in each of your character's limbs. Some people insist that the power level of every D&D class should be totally equalized for every situation, and some will tell you that balance doesn't matter in RPGs at all because there's no explicit goal for a given campaign, and GMs can just change rules on the fly. I've met several of both types of player. In fact, I've been both of those players at various points in my life, and I honestly couldn't tell you which group is larger. It's almost like they're
perfectly balanced, as all things should.
No, they're not! This is not how all things should be. While plenty of min-maxing nerds can exaggerate the significance of some of the minute details of D&D's action economy, the fact is that balance is an important concept in role-playing games. And since most systems aren't incredibly well balanced, knowing how to work around these imbalances is pretty important for GMs to learn. Regardless, the muddy field of discourse around balance in RPGs is made even muddier by the fact that most people couldn't even tell you what balance actually means. For a while, I thought no one could even come up with a definition of game balance that everyone will agree with. But it turns out, yeah, someone totally did. That someone is Oren Ashkenazi of Mythcreants, a blog that publishes some of the best advice for both game masters and writers that I've ever read. Definitely check them out if you haven't already. Anyway, he defines balance in role-playing games as the idea that a mechanic or character option should have a level of power appropriate to its role. The rest of the article is about why balance is important, and while it's useful, I don't want to just parrot Oren's talking points. Not only because it wouldn't add anything new to the conversation, but also because his definition of balance, while completely accurate, could use plenty more explanation that he never really dives into. Also, Oren's advice seems more directed toward game designers, while this video is intended mostly to inform game masters about what imbalance looks like and how to erase it from your campaign. And yes, you can rid your game of all imbalance without making any changes to the system. As for how, well, let me explain. Part 1. Giving everyone power. So for every mechanic to have a level of power appropriate to its role, that means each player character should be as powerful as every other player character. And by extension, each class should be as powerful as every other class, each smaller feature should be as powerful as every other feature you could choose at that point, etc. That might seem pretty obvious, but a lot of people misunderstand what power actually means in a role-playing context. Determining which of two characters is more powerful is a lot more complicated than just asking who would win in a fight based on what kind of superpowers they have. In Masks, you can have a kid with a maul katana on the same team as a reality warper, and they'll feel equally important most of the time. Power is really about the ability for a character to accomplish their goals and put themselves in the spotlight. So if we go back to Masks, we have the Beacon, who's the kid with a maul katana, and the Nova, who's the reality warper. The Nova can obviously attempt way more things with their powers, but when they fail a roll, the results are bad, really bad. Now, if the Nova accidentally blows up a city block while trying to levitate a soda can, that'll definitely still put the narrative spotlight on that character in a way that the Beacon can't really replicate. But that's okay, because the Beacon is actually kind of better at getting shit done. In Masks, your character's competence is inversely proportional to the number of conditions you have marked. And the Beacon is really good at clearing conditions, while the Nova is constantly marking them. Without the penalties that come from conditions, the Beacon will succeed more often and will be less likely to be taken down in combat. So ultimately, the idea that spellcasters are automatically stronger than martial characters doesn't have to be true as long as you give martial characters something cool and unique to compensate. With that in mind, let's look back to D&D. The fighter and the wizard are about equally powerful in combat, but outside of combat, the wizard has a huge list of utility spells, while the fighter is barely more useful than a commoner NPC. The few fighter features that aren't combat focused, like Know Your Enemy, are laughably weak compared to even first or second level spells. So with that in mind, the apparent solution is to make fighters even more effective in combat than wizards. The problem is that while most D&D games do include plenty of combat, Just how combat-centric they are varies from table to table. Some games are focused entirely on combat, and in those games, those new rules would make fighters straight up overpowered, just like wizards are in a combat-light game. So guess what? It's impossible for D&D to be balanced for everyone. Part 2, everything is broken. Now, PBTA games like Masks have it easy, because not only are they mechanically simple without a ton of different rules for each character, and also not only because they incorporate personality flaws into the game mechanics, but also because they're very focused on a specific type of story and explicitly tell you that the game isn't built for anything else. But even in Masks, the number of times a given feature will become relevant depends heavily on the campaign. And D&D, with its more complex mechanics and larger scope, has it much worse. Granted, it's a little better off than a system like GURPS, which claims to be able to run literally anything, and as a result, it's possible to build a custom ability that destroys the entire universe for less than the number of character points it takes to raise your dexterity by 3 points. Still, D&D is in an awkward place because it was originally intended as little more than a dungeon crawling simulator, and that's apparent even in 5th edition. It's why most discussions about balance usually focus on whether each class is equally useful in combat, and it's also why Rope Trick is the same level as Detect Thoughts. But D&D's horizons have vastly expanded since its creation. It's still a fantasy adventure game, but it's no longer strictly a dungeon crawling game, in the eyes of both players and creators. In the latest official module, WotC specifically advertises the fact that the PCs can clear the entire adventure without ever getting into a fight. It's cool that they made a module like that, but doesn't that mean fighters are essentially useless in that campaign? Yes it does. It's impossible to measure whether a feature has a level of power appropriate to its role because the level of power depends entirely on context. Forget classes, the power level of smaller features like spells and feats depends purely on how often those features happen to be relevant. Usually, Blight is a pretty underwhelming attack spell, but if your campaign is heavily inspired by Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, it'll overshadow every other combat option in the game. The Chef feat will sit unused on 99% of character sheets, but if Asmodeus happens to challenge the party to a cooking contest, then that feat could save the world. There's no way for the game designers to know how often a given feature will come in handy, so as a system, D&D will never be balanced, and neither will Shadowrun, Starfinder, or pretty much any big tactical system. But your game can certainly be balanced. And as a GM, all you need to do is make that cooking contest happen. Part 3, you can fix it. Surprise, surprise, the way to run a good game is to be a proactive GM. And that's just as true for balancing player abilities as it is for everything else. If it seems like one player feels useless either during or outside combat, it's up to you to find out what sort of niche that character could fill and insert that niche into the campaign. For example, if you're running an intrigue-heavy campaign and one of your players is a Battlemaster fighter, you can set up a mystery where the PCs are trying to find an undercover general at a party, where they can identify their number of fighter levels using Know Your Enemy. If your party's ranger took Giant Killer, be sure to throw plenty of large enemies at the heroes. Similarly, if one player seems to be stealing the show, you should tailor the adventure so their abilities aren't always effective. This can be difficult if you're running a published adventure, but those are generally easy enough to modify, especially if we're just talking about combat encounters. Even outside of combat, pretty much all the modules boil down to fetching MacGuffins and killing the big bad, so there's room to change the methods the PCs can use to find the MacGuffins. Speaking of changing pre-written content, I do think that simply tailoring the adventure to suit the party is good enough to balance most campaigns. But there are some cases where you'll want to lay down some house rules. If you're running a murder mystery, Detect Thoughts is just too powerful, and you'll probably want to nerf or ban it. On the other hand, the benefits of a feat like Actor are incredibly situational, even in a socially focused campaign. So you might want to throw in a free skill proficiency if you want players to actually consider taking it. I'm not going to delve too deeply into how to homebrew, since that's a topic for another video. And if your players know what they're getting into, you probably don't need to make any super drastic changes. On that note, you should also make sure to communicate with your players during the intro session about what the game will focus on. If it's going to be a hack and slash dungeon crawl, your players will know to build their characters mostly with combat in mind. If it'll involve plenty of social conflict, they'll know social skills will actually be useful. Keep in mind that this isn't a substitute for fixing imbalances mid-campaign, but simply a method to help minimize them. You both can't and shouldn't tell your players about every single encounter in Session 0, so the players will never be able to make a perfectly balanced party right out of the gate. But Session 0 should absolutely give you a blueprint for what each character is about and what you can do to give everyone plenty of moments to shine. Conclusion. This might have been a lot to process, but the takeaway is that systems can never be balanced. Campaigns can. Granted, some systems are more conducive to a balanced campaign than others, and your game is less likely to be balanced if you stretch the premise beyond what the system is built for. But you're the GM, you're the master of your campaign's universe. More so than any game designer, you have all the power you need to ensure all of your player characters are equally awesome. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you all so much for watching, make sure to leave a like if you appreciate it, and I'll see you all next time.